Oh, wait, where?
Hello.
Is Fred coming?
He's defending his dissertation.
Okay.
He might come later.
Thank you for coming out. My name's Alex. I'm here on behalf of Flyleaf. So thank you for your support of our independent bookstore. Your attendance and book purchase let us keep having these events, so we appreciate it. This evening, we have the pleasure of hearing from Benjamin Waterhouse presenting his book, One Day I'll Work for Myself, with Lauren LeBlanc. Benjamin Waterhouse is the author of Lobbying America, The Politics of Business from Nixon to NAFTA, and The Land of Enterprise, A Business History of the United States. A frequent contributor to Washington Post, he is a professor of history at UNC Chapel Hill. Lauren LeBlanc is an independent editor and writer and a board member of the National Book Critics Circle. She has written for the New York Times Book Review, The Atlantic, Vanity Fair, The Believer, and the Boston Globe, among other publications. A native New Orleanian, she lives in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Thank you. We hope you enjoy, and if you don't have a book yet, you can get one up front following the event and have Benjamin sign it. All right, thank you.
I think this is on. Thank you all very much for being here, and thank you, Lauren, for agreeing to talk with me and sort of structure this as an interview and a conversation. Our plan is to talk for 30 minutes or so. Is it 40? I don't remember what the deal was. At which point we'll also have time for questions and a larger discussion with all of you. But I'm very grateful for folks who are here, those I know and those I don't know. Thank you for coming, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is a lot of fun. I myself am a freelancer, and I think this is on. Is it everybody here?
Yeah.
For going on 9 years. So when I was asked to speak about this book, I thought, well, that's really appropriate. So like a lot of other people, I was laid off from a major corporation and found myself in a situation where I was going to be working. I decided I'd work for myself because it would give me more flexibility. But so I'm sure a lot of other people here also have had these similar experiences or bringing it to their reading of this book and this conversation tonight. So I'm excited to hear people's questions. Would you like to start by just talking a little bit about your focus as a historian and looking at labor, the history of it in the United States specifically, and sort of what drew you to this topic?
Yeah, I'd be happy to start there. When I'm asked to describe myself and sort of where I situate myself in my profession, I have taken to describing my interests as the culture and politics of business in the United States, which is a sort of niche subfield within what you might describe as business history, but it also has a lot to say to the fields of social history and political history. The earliest historical research I did as a graduate student that became the first book that I wrote was about the political mobilizing and the lobbying of large corporations and their associations in the 1970s and 1980s. The questions that I was really fundamentally interested in at that point, in many ways, are the same questions that I'm interested in today, which is, why do people in the United States think the things that they do about the business world, about the economic system, about the relationship between governments, state, federal, and otherwise, and enterprise? And why do we hold the ideas that we do in all of their diversity, but also for all of their political power? And so I came to this book in particular out of a desire to look at a different part of the business world. I had spent a long time as a grad student and then in the early part of my faculty career looking at large companies and large business organizations that served large companies in particular. And I was very aware that that wasn't the entirety of the business world. In fact, that smaller companies are really an overwhelming majority of business enterprises. And I thought that they had an important part. They played an important part of this story, but I didn't really know how to study them. And I didn't know what it would mean to try to treat small businesses analytically the way I had treated large businesses. And what that ultimately led me to was a study that's less about the companies than about the people surrounding them, the people who run them, the people who work for them, and the ideas in particular that kind of drive people to work for themselves. And so the the project moved from one that was kind of where small business was the focal point to one where the idea of owning your own business became the thing that I tried to track historically.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed to me that idea, the dream, it's we have these ideas about American dreams, so home ownership and self-employment. Like, I wonder sometimes, like, when people are in the middle of that, either just like figuring out your taxes as a self-employed person or dealing with a house falling apart, like, would it be easier to be a part of a greater collective? And what is it that makes us think that these things are what we want to aspire to? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the mythology and sort of looking at it from the beginning, like the origins of the United States, sort of agricultural society, to how it moved on, Horatio Alger, and so on.
Yeah, so there's a great sense in which the notion of working for oneself, of being self-reliant, is deeply embedded in American culture and American history. And this, of course, goes all the way back to the country's origins. In fact, even before the country's origins, there's long been this sort of cultural ideal of self-autonomy, of independence. An example I use early on in the book is Thomas Jefferson, writing in the 1780s, saying that we should never want to see our fellow man, very gendered language, behind the workbench when the ideal would be to own your own farm and be the independent person, the mythical yeoman farmer, right, who is completely in charge of their own destiny. And this, for Jefferson, was kind of where real political virtue and freedom was held. And of course, we could go into the cosmic ironies of Jefferson's conception of who's doing the laboring, right, and the whole notion of the freeholding farmer. But he was reflecting something that was very much a part of the way Americans in the early part of in the colonial period and then the early national period understood really what independence was. That there was this something to being able to take care of yourself, take care of your family, and not be reliant on a government, a master, or even an employer. Because if push came to shove, if you were a worker in a factory, or even if you owned the factory, you couldn't eat the widgets that you were making. And that was sort of deeply ingrained, I think, in that Jeffersonian ideology. And of course, in the 19th century, things start to change very quickly with the advent of industrial society. And yet this notion of being independent, of really taking care of yourself, was very, very strong and very dominant. What I came to
something you were seeing in culture that made that the case, or is this something that was coming out of necessity?
In the 19th century, you mean?
Right, yeah.
Well, I think we see it all over American culture. Mm-hmm. We see it all over American literature. We see it in politics. What we see increasingly throughout, I think, the rise of industrial society is a contest, right, between the possibilities of independence, but also the opportunities or the possibilities that come from employment on a larger and larger scale. What I think, is important, and I guess the point that I came to with this research is that there's a place for kind of fixed cultural ideas, mm-hmm, and then there's a place for contingency, for change, for what actually shifts in the American experience. And what I started to notice is that the way people in the United States, politicians, authors, writers, commentators, the way people were kind of conceiving of independent work and working for themselves seemed to take a different turn far more recently, right? In the 1970s and 1980s, mm-hmm, especially if you compare it to what was going on right after World War II. The United States economy in the years after World War II was predicated on large corporations, on large government programs, on big labor unions, these sort of hallmarks of bigness. By the 1970s and 1980s, those things were all kind of coming in for criticism. And this notion of recapturing some sort of Jeffersonian ideal seemed to be making a comeback. And I was really trying to figure out how that happened. One of the observations that one of my editors made was, the people in the 1970s were every bit the people in the 1950s, I should say, were every bit the sort of intellectual descendants of Jefferson as the people 25 years later were. So what changed? And that's kind of what led me to the structure and framing of this project, which really starts in earnest in the 1970s with the profound economic changes that the country was going through. The end of the rapid period of economic growth that we saw after World War II, Between the mid-1940s and the mid-1970s, economic inequality shrank in the United States. The rich and the poor were actually converging. It's not to say that everything was peachy keen and everything was wonderful, and those are the good old days we should go back to. But there was quite a bit of economic leveling in important ways. That started to reverse itself in the 70s, and the prospects for kind of doing better generation to generation started to decrease. And it was exactly in that moment that it seemed to me that something in the zeitgeist was changing, and people were more eager to embrace this notion of achieving economic upward mobility, or even any sort of economic prosperity by going it alone.
So why was economic inequality shrinking in the 50s? Is it purely because of the boom of the post-war and the kind of structures were in place to make that possible? Because wouldn't you think in some ways that people would want to stay in that space, right? And part of it too. You think so? And but also too, I mean, and I'm looking at it too in terms of social movements. People who wanted to get in on that, was it so much too that people wanted access to that kind of job, that kind of opportunity, that then the organizations and the companies wanted to limit that, and they were also dealing with a lot of litigious.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the short answer, this is, that's an entire kind of topic of historical research in its own right, but the short answer is, politics and labor unions. That in the kind of regrowth or the rebuilding period after World War II, labor unions were historically at a strong point, and that is able to put pressure on employers to allocate resources in ways that bring more returns to labor than, say, to investors or to capitalists or to owners. The political system was broadly structured to accommodate this, and there was a sort of magical moment. I say magical because I think economic historians don't really agree on why it happened or why it changed. There was a moment of significantly increasing economic productivity in the American economy. And those productivity gains were largely captured by, as I said, workers and people sort of in the bottom part of the economic strata. And while the bosses and the wealthy and the capitalists grumbled, there was a limit to what they could do about it. This is the kind of political economy that starts to change profoundly in the 1970s. And one of the concerns I noted, and one of the things that actually drove me to write this book, it was to try to appreciate and understand the degree to which these ideas change in a way that becomes self-reinforcing. The notion that the economy is no good for people like me. Like you said, I'm laid off from a job. If you're by the 70s and 80s and 90s, if you're in a sort of lower end job, you're more likely to see your wages stagnate. You're less likely to be represented by a union and have the benefits that come from that. And what you see is this sort of cultural notion that we should kind of jump ship and abandon the corporate world and strike out on our own. And this becomes, as I said, a sort of self-reinforcing scenario where the ideal, even if it's not borne out in reality, becomes a sort of justification for an unequal and less equitable and less profitable economy.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm curious about too, is just like, where is it within culture and society that perpetuates this myth that despite the fact that the evidence is there, that it's not as easy a venture as one would imagine, how is that being perpetuated?
Well, I try to identify a lot of different ways to approach this problem in the book, and I try to tell the stories of different kinds of people. A lot of it is in intellectual circles, right? In business schools, in the way that experts and academics are describing the economy and how it works and where value comes from, takes on a noted shift by the 1970s and 80s, and entrepreneurship becomes the sort of key driver of the economy among a large number of business theorists. At the same time, on a kind of less abstract intellectual level, you have the proliferation of celebrity spokespeople for owning your own business, how-to books and TV shows, and this kind of culminates in the 21st century in things like Shark Tank, or even The Apprentice, but let's focus on Shark Tank.
Let's think about Martha Stewart instead.
where the
benevolent dictators, yeah.
where the kind of the message is you, whoever you are, can find that new idea, can capture that lightning in a bottle and achieve greatness and wealth for yourself. Politicians seize on this as well, and it's a no-brainer for politicians. Nobody has ever lost an election because they said nice things about small business owners. This is a very common and increasingly prevalent bipartisan kind of commitment. And what I chart in the book is that there's organizations that form to encourage this ideal. There's lobbying campaigns that have specific policy focuses, but also kind of bring up the ideas, whether it's defending the Small Business Administration or pushing back against efforts to raise the minimum wage or regulate environmental protection laws and things like that, that reinforce this notion that business ownership and new business and entrepreneurship are the keys to economic wealth and prosperity.
Going back to that idea that you were talking about just now about looking at organizations that lobbied, that was something for me that was, while reading the book, that I was surprised to learn about. I mean, I know these things exist, but it is an element that I thought was particularly illuminating. Could you talk a little bit about how those developed and sort of what their role was initially, and then how they've changed over time?
Sure. I mean, this is kind of tying this all into my longer research agenda, but one of the main arguments that I made in my earlier book was that the 1970s and 1980s really witnessed a kind of high watermark of organized business lobbying in the name of the business system, broadly speaking. Now, that's not to say there's not a lot of kind of very specific issue lobbying by specific companies or specific industries, but at the same time, there's this widespread campaign to kind of defend this idea of a market system or of a free enterprise system. Its kind of progenitors are large business organizations. What starts to happen increasingly by the 1970s and into the 1980s is a handful of smaller and newer lobbying organizations come in explicitly to link the goals of these big business organizations with the goals of smaller companies. One of them that I chart in particular is an organization called the American Business Conference, which is not something that you hear a whole lot about these days, but they kind of embody this early 80s Reagan era faith in hot ticket, fast growth companies, mid-sized companies that are not these kind of clunky old corporate dinosaurs, but they're also not sort of just mom and pop shops that do their thing and are stable. They're rapidly growing, and they band together. They're very bipartisan. They bring in Democrats as well as Republicans. They are the darlings of the Reagan administration, but also the kind of more business-friendly wing of the Democratic Party in the 80s. And they really helped champion this idea that resources, government policies, programs, grants, etc., need to be focused on these types of kind of upstart, high growth companies. And it doves perfectly into an era where technology companies in California are all the rage. Right? This is the time of Apple's rapid growth and Microsoft's rapid growth, and many other companies, Fairfield Semiconductors and everything you can think of, are exploding onto the business scene and promising to kind of rescue the country from the doldrums that had been brought about by sometimes are described as the corporate dinosaurs of the mid-20th century.
Mm-hmm. But in some way too, I'm wondering too how they operate on a global level as well. So much of this is about this American dream and kind of ethos, but at the same time, in the 80s as well, kind of how do they reach out beyond that?
Well, I mean, there's a global aspect to this story that I am only starting to crack into, which is actually really quite exciting. There is this concept of entrepreneurialism that takes on a global shape, and in exactly the period of time that I'm concerned with here, where you start to see the proliferation of entrepreneurship studies in business schools. You start to see research undertaken that tries to mimic the American example, and you see the same types of sort of political speech patterns all over the world. You find, the Prime Minister of Australia talking about small business as the backbone of the economy, and you talk about Margaret Thatcher and the importance of business and sort of corporate welfare or corporate well-being as a sort of way to get past the Britain's particular political economic challenges and so forth. So on an ideological level, on an institutional level, we do see this around the world. And at the moment, my view on that is that the United States is sort of a leader in this process for a wide range of reasons, but other countries, particularly kind of wealthier countries, are quickly following in the same path. And then eventually it becomes something where the concept of promoting new business and business expansion become kind of dovetails with international development aims. And you have concerted efforts to create programs of microloans to small sheep farmers in the developing world, so that somebody can take on a small loan and presumably increase their flock or engage in some other expansion or entrepreneurial activity to bring the promises of growth to wherever they happen to be.
Right, which in some ways sounds like a sort of kind of gentler form of colonialism, imperialism, with entrepreneurs at the helm instead of nations and monarchs. But and I guess that leads into kind of another idea, is like how, reading this book, I was thinking a lot about the ways in which working for oneself is a way of self-elevation, but then all of a sudden it became so clear to me the different strata of what it means to work for oneself. You can go into it saying one is an entrepreneur, but then that's also how people talk about their children's lemonade stands. I think that the idea of what it means to work for oneself and be all of the different roles that you have to take on, but also, or at what point do you get to be Elon Musk and simply sell the company and reap the benefit of that? So what is the end point, and kind of where, if you could give some examples of people you encountered in your research who sort of went one direction and found themselves in another, or...
Yeah, I mean, there's as many reasons to go into business as there are people who go into business for themselves, right? And so it's very difficult to generalize, but as you say, there's a lot of different...
But we depend upon those generalizations. That's what I'm saying, that like, where does culture come into play, right? And where does, in what degree do these organizations, this small business owner, lobbyist groups, play into that mythology, right? Right,
and I think, to skip to the end, where you see this sort of play out is the ethos around the gig economy in the last 10 years or so, where the very language that companies were using to solicit, drivers for Uber or people who will do work for something like TaskRabbit, is this language of be your own boss, work for yourself, be a business owner, exactly the same kind of language that is in the multi-level marketing world. Right, that has a slightly longer history, actually in some cases a substantially longer history than the gig economy, but it's all the same type of language. It's also the exact same type of language that's used in the franchising world, right? So when companies are out soliciting potential franchisees to pay their money and sign on as whether it's a McDonald's and Burger King, or whether it's a gutter cleaner or a Merry Maid's outfit or whatever it is, they're using the same exact language. But of course, you're right. Plenty of people go into business for themselves with no particular expectation of becoming wealthy. There's a lot of reasons that people do it. Sometimes it's a personality issue. Some people have a particular expertise or training that allows them to kind of take advantage of what you might call an inefficiency in the labor market, such that they can make more or less the same amount of money working for themselves as like an accountant out of their house as they could going to work for a large accountancy. Many other people, on the other hand, try to go into business for themselves and find that they, in fact, are not making the same kind of money that they might have made if they took their skills and their labor to the traditional labor market. It very much depends on who you are, what you do, and what your alternatives are. There are plenty of people who are happy to take that haircut, who say, all right, I could make this amount of money working a traditional job, but I don't want to, right? I value the time in my home, not having a commute, spending, constructing my own schedule, and it's worth it to me to make a little bit less money than I otherwise would have. That's certainly a real and common motivation for people. And then you have a whole swath of people who are in the entrepreneurship literature referred to as necessity entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. And these are people for whom going into business for yourself is the least worst option. Mm-hmm. People who are, for whatever reason, for a range of reasons, sort of excluded from the benefits of the traditional labor market. I talk in the book at great length about the immigrant entrepreneur experience. And this is something that has multiple sides to it, right? There are, of course, this is also something that goes way back in American history and is something that people are frequently, speak of in very positive terms as, the United States is a place where people can come from all parts of the world and work hard and kind of make something of themselves and have greater opportunities, which for many people is certainly the case. For other people, it is certainly the case that the act of being, or the fact of being an immigrant, perhaps having language barriers, or perhaps having a lack of social connections and networks, perhaps having an education that either you don't have an education or you have an education that doesn't translate very easily into the workforce, limits your opportunities. And there are lots of examples of immigrants who go into business for themselves, some successfully, some not successfully, some in the middle, but they do so because that's the best option for them. And my suggestion is that we don't always need to look at that as an unbridled good, that can be an indication of a social failure as well.
Oh yeah, no, I think so as well. Yeah, it's interesting how that idea is sort of lost today when we look at the immigration kind of story and what what is deemed a crisis, right? It's not seen as a labor opportunity, or and we don't. But I guess too, I wonder how much of this sort of like mythology about self-employment has to do with the ways that we talk about work and like the way that we talk about wealth in this country too. I think that was another thing I was thinking about too. Is so much of this kind of what's the word, like elevation of being an entrepreneur, what's lost on people is the idea of where the capital comes from. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that too. like where people, and I wonder if some of these organizations are also helping people find investors or where this is coming from, or what where people are with this kind of where they are in terms of like they see this dream, they want to have it, they want it for themselves. How is that possible?
I think, you're right. So one of the big themes here is that, of the millions and millions of people who work for themselves, mm-hmm. a very small number will hit it rich, right? And but they capture a lion's share of the attention.
Right.
And so that warps the way people make their own decisions, right? I'm going to do this because I've seen on, this TV show or this podcast or in this book, the person who made it rich, who became the proverbial rich dad instead of the poor dad. So that already skews the way people make decisions out of kind of context to what reality is.
Right.
And I think that's, something that is worth noting and worth people taking a second look at as they make life decisions. The question you asked about financing is a fascinating one because the vast majority of independent business people, whether they are working just at a one-person operation or a small store or a small manufacturing outfit, are not borrowing huge amounts of money and they're not getting VC investors. Mm-hmm. Maybe they're getting a bank loan. Very small number are getting small business administration loans. So most small, about the 30-some million people who are kind of counted in one way or another as working for themselves, very few, relatively speaking, are taking advantage or are able to take advantage of lending, of the financial system. However, this boom that I've sort of argued is sort of historically situated in the period of the late 20th century and early 21st century happens to accompany, and I say that facetiously, it's not a coincidence, but it accompanies a major change in how capital is allocated in the United States and the creation of an economy where the returns to capital, the returns to investment, quickly outpace the returns to labor itself. And those things flip-flop from the mid-20th century to the late 20th century. What that means is that there's a lot of people there's a lot of money looking for investment opportunities, and that's the case today. As I said, it's a small number of companies, and they tend to be concentrated in particular sectors like information technology and computers, particular parts of the country like Silicon Valley. But that seems to be the model that people have in mind. Like, oh, you're going to start a business. Have you thought about VC investing? Well, it, very much depends on what you're trying to do. And for the most part, it's probably not a very good idea to be giving over, a significant chunk of the control of your operation to a major investor if you're not in one of those very niche things. And even if you are in one of those very niche operations, it's very possible that you're going to, fail. And the investors, of course, don't need everybody to win. They just need some of their investments to win.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also kind of a framework that people apply in lots of different situations. Thinking about like crowdsourcing, I wonder if you could talk about that as well. It's like this kind of normalization of this idea that the community is dependent on funding businesses and different other things in that way. That it's in the past it would have seemed like, well, shouldn't there be other channels, or who is responsible to keep businesses afloat or to create businesses? Where do people do that? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly what we see is a culture that prizes individual economic initiative above collective action and above institutions, whether they're state or nonprofit or in some other sector. And I think we could list myriad ways in which this sort of way of thinking about the economy manifests itself. And as you said, crowdsourcing is one. I mean, this gets taken to extreme cases when we talk about, for example, failures in the healthcare system, and somebody's got a gigantic health bill from necessary life-saving medical procedure, but they can't pay it, and so they're on
funeral expenses.
Exactly. All of which is part of a larger thing that there are academic inquiries into this that talk about the kind of way ideas and policies intersect under a certain kind of way of thinking, a certain framework of thinking that privileges the individual above all else, that privileges the market and market transactions as the best way to organize society. This is all kind of the undercurrent of what I think is a somewhat more narrow, if capacious, story that I'm telling about the ideal of working for yourself.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think. Could you talk a little bit more? I mean, how much did you want to talk about the idea of franchising too? I think this is something else that I think is really interesting. Is this notion of spiraling off of a larger institution and being able to take it for yourself, something outside of the realm of like being this kind of brilliant genius who comes up with an idea for a company that no one's ever heard of, and then you do it. It's a different approach, but I wonder how much people are interested in that today, and how much you looked at it and saw the way that it's grown, or how is it successful or not successful today? Yeah, so what I was
particularly intrigued about with the concept of franchising is the sort of timeline, which this was very new to me, and I was very interested to figure this out. We often think about franchising as a kind of quintessential post-World War II suburbanization kind of phenomenon where McDonald's kind of pops onto the scene, and then you've got different types of fast food restaurants and things like that. And in a way, that's true. The kind of early stage of the current franchise model is a product of the first, the middle third or so of the 20th century. What happens in the 1990s is that all of that continues, right? All of your Dunkin' Donuts and your McDonald's continue to grow and expand along the same model that they've had for decades. But the number of types of franchise opportunities increases rapidly. And throughout the 1990s, in 1980s and 1990s, you have lobbying organizations or trade associations for lobbyists saying this is the business of the future. This is the way that things are going to go. And so it's not just fast food and donuts and coffee and gas stations and motels. Now it's, as I was saying before, it's your house cleaners, it's your tax preparers, it's your folks who blow the leaves out of your gutters, all of which become part of this franchise universe. janitorial services in in office buildings, things like that, and they all use this same kind of idea and language that this is the way to work for yourself. The slogan of the International Franchise Association is, you're in business for yourself, but not by yourself. So we're going to backstop you. And the economic question becomes: is that in fact a viable option in a competitive business environment? And in many cases, it's not. There are people who do well running franchises, but there are plenty of people who kind of get sucked into the hype that this is going to be the surefire path to riches. And if they are not able to sort of take advantage of some market niche or opportunity, they find themselves basically treading water, or worse. And there are plenty of people who lose their shirts thinking that they are going to get into some surefire franchise deal.
Yeah. How much of that do you think? I mean, and you're talking about this too. I mean, how much of that is coming from those kind of organizations who are dictating this? That is a viable model, and how much of that is also, in terms of being able to kind of abdicate responsibility for benefits, vacation, etc. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, one of the key benefits of the franchise model from the perspective of the corporate entity, the franchisor, is that you outsource all of those things, right? You outsource risk, you outsource investment, you outsource upfront costs for property, and you have, so basically my suggestion, if you were interested in getting into it, is don't buy the franchise license, sell it, right? Because that's where the real returns are going to be.
I wonder if you want to talk about kind of like the regulation over time in American history of these businesses and growth and so on. Just thinking about the gig economy now, what you get into at the end of the book with Uber, how those businesses are able to avoid regulation, and also in what ways can the government intervene in order to create protections?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest issue with the gig economy from a regulatory perspective is the super exciting issue of worker misclassification law,
right?
Which is the question of whether somebody's an independent contractor or an employer, and this is what is being debated in lawsuits and in ballot initiatives in different parts of the country today. The fundamental question is, an independent contractor is broadly but vaguely identified in law as different from an employee. Employees are subject to certain privileges and rights and protections, from the minimum wage to workers' compensation to provisions of OSHA and things like that. An independent contractor is a business, right? It's a separate business. There is no rule that says a business has to make money. Fraud is one thing, but doing business at a loss, it's actually perfectly legal and totally your right to do. If you are an independent contractor, all of that applies to you. If you are an employee, you have a right to be paid for your labor, and you cannot be, you cannot work and not get paid.
Right.
And so that's the sort of source. That's the place at the moment that these arguments are taking place. The gig economy has been built on the idea of independent contractors. All of these companies that are making their path toward profitability are largely doing so on the basis of the people doing the work are treated as independent contractors. They're treated as non-employees. And companies like Uber fight for that distinction because if they didn't, if your Uber driver or your Amazon delivery person was in fact an employee of the company, then, for example, somebody other than the driver would have to pay for the car.
Right. No, and I think it's interesting the way that people are moving towards this idea of wanting to see themselves as a business, and yet corporations insist upon being seen as individuals with their own rights. But I was wondering, getting back to like a kind of a larger conversation, I think, what about this book did you go into it with some kind of expectations, and was there anything about this project that surprised you or unsettled you?
Maybe the one thing that I often think about as it was a surprise to find in the archive, and it was surprising that it became newly relevant, and that was the concept of working from home. I ended up at an archive at Harvard University in the papers of a person who had been a Radcliffe master's student in the 1950s and went on to a long career in consulting and then as a home business advocate and researcher. And she advised clients and she wrote papers for the Small Business Administration and eventually retired and gave her papers to Harvard. And that gave me a window into what I describe as a movement in the 1980s, privileging and pushing the idea of working from home. It grew out of the telecommuting push that itself was a product of the 1970s and the oil crisis and the price of gasoline and shortages and things like that. And then it took on new life in the 80s with the advent of the personal computer and the spread of the fax machine. And what I argue in this section of the book is that this was really it was a moment and it was a movement that had boosters, it had political support, it had all of these things going on. And then it flamed out. By the early 1990s, people were prophesying that in the future, everybody will work from home, and 99% of all work will be done out of the home, and we'll have brought home and work together under the roof, and we'll have gotten rid of this sort of foreign, weird thing where you spend 8, 9, 10 hours of your day apart from your family, and this will be great. Companies are saying, yep, this is definitely going to happen, and then it doesn't. And by the early 2000s, you've got major employers, especially in tech companies and these sort of younger, hipper places, actively trying to make work a cool place to be.
Right. Investing in these campuses.
Exactly.
That are going to keep you there forever.
Right. So by like 2013, 2014, people are asking, Google and Facebook, how many of your employees work at home? And their answer is as few as possible. Mm-hmm. Well, then lo and behold, 2020 rolls around, right? And suddenly, we all have to work from home, or not all of us, but those of us who don't have the type of jobs that have to be done in person, those essential workers. And this restarts this debate about working from home, whether it's beneficial, whether it's productive, whether it's kind of authoritarian on behalf of the employer to insist that you show up at the office versus sort of inefficient and loosey-goosey to have everybody at home, or maybe everyone's happier working at home because they can spend time with their families and take a nap and watch TV in the middle of the day or whatever it is. And these debates are ongoing. I mean, as we've
or
kind
just work all the time. I mean, yeah. No, I was thinking too. I mean, how much did you thinking about you talking about that too? Thinking about the idea of like the rise of the home computer, how it was built at first, and then the idea of a home office. And then when did that shift away design-wise and then become, I guess in the 90s, right? And then
well, it goes from being, it's funny, I was actually having exactly this conversation with one of my kids the other day. We used to talk about the den, mm-hmm. right, or the library. And then in the 80s, it became the home office. And that was largely brought to you by the good people at IBM and Apple and tech companies that were selling products so that you would, have the same sort of space in your house, but it became productive. It became a workspace. Now, did it really just become the place that you plugged in your Nintendo? Probably. But at least in the ideal, it became the place where the work would be done. Mm-hmm. And this I think is an important cultural transformation in American life that is worth paying attention to. Yeah.
We should probably open this up for questions. Does anyone have any questions?
So there's no clock in here, so we have no idea how long we've been going on.
Yeah.
But yes, we'd be happy to talk.
Great. Thank you. This is fascinating. And so as somebody who comes to this outside of U.S. history, I was struck by the international comparisons. And I was hoping you could talk about the distinction between working for yourself, the gig economy, and what people looking at other parts of the world call the informal sector.
Yeah. And
when people look at, the Congo, they see all these people working for themselves, and hustling and doing all this stuff, they talk about it like it's a bad thing. Mm-hmm. This is a problem, this is a limitation of the economy, which strikes me as the opposite of the way you're talking about the selling of the gig economy in the United States. So can you kind of
it's one of the great ironies of this whole thing, and there are people who take a much stronger stance than I do about the sort of pernicious effects of this mythology, and there are some economists who have written about exactly this phenomenon and said, look, if you go through most parts of the world, you can chart an inverse relationship between the wealth of a society and the number of people who work for themselves. Like, so it's not that this is causing the economic hardship. This is a result of the economic underdevelopment, and that's that's a common refrain when it comes to the developing world that doesn't get discussed in this sort of this Americanized version of it, but it still happens, right? If you go to certain parts of the country, and it depends on where you are, places that are economically less robust and less well developed do tend to have a fairly high level of people working for themselves. It's hard, there's informal in the United States, we'd be talking more about like sort of illicit stuff, generally speaking. But then there's things that are sort of on the cusp. Somebody has a storefront, somebody has an operation, and the informality might have to do with how good they are about following the rules, paying the taxes, declaring the wages of the workers and things like that. Generally speaking, if you're like really trying to make it on the up and up, or you're working with banks in the financial sector, or you're looking for investors, you don't fool around with that sort of stuff. But if you need to, if this is something where your kind of livelihood depends on this, then yes, you're going to be doing exactly, even if what you're doing is legal. I'm not talking about selling drugs and things that are kind of on the face against the law, but you're more likely to kind of skirt the rules if you can.
I wonder if you could talk about sort of women over these years and changes in the workforce, and then what kind of is the role of gender and women in those changes over the years.
Yeah, it's a great question and a great point. We're all probably very familiar with the notion that women enter the workforce in the United States in larger numbers, particularly in sort of the 1960s. There's an uptick in women working outside the home. There's about a 10-year lag from that moment to a dramatic uptick in women owning their own businesses. And the prevalence of women's business ownership really shoots up dramatically, starting in the very late 1970s and all through the 1980s. And this becomes like the big story of the kind of entrepreneurial culture. It never, we never see parity, right? That's never the case that women own the same number of businesses as men. Women are, in fact, even to this day, much more likely to own what are called non-employer firms, which are companies that don't have any employees. They're just the person, which incidentally outnumber companies with employees by a factor of like 5. So 27 million non-employer firms to 5 or 6 million employer firms. Women have increased their numbers in both of those camps, but dramatically so in the kind of one-person shop operations. There's a sense in which some of the people who are kind of boosting business ownership as an economic salvation, as a way to pull up people, particularly from, as like Lisa was mentioning, economically underdeveloped places or parts of society, focusing particularly on women. And there's a story I tell in the book about a particularly interesting, I think, entrepreneurial woman who had a career in large corporations before sort of deciding to go into the business of promoting young girls, promoting business ownership to young girls. And she created a board game in the late 1980s called an Income of Her Own, which was obviously a play on Virginia Woolf, but it was a game that they would take, and she had a whole little nonprofit that did this. They would go to schools, high schools, and rec centers, and girls clubs and things like that, and encourage young girls, particularly from economically disadvantaged communities, to consider entrepreneurship as the way to kind of get out of cycles of poverty and sort of maintain or establish their independence and their own economic uplift. So there's a reality, which is that more and more women were in fact owning their businesses relative to earlier periods where it was sort of single-digit percentages, and there's this mythology that's kind of recapitulated that says this is the way to overcome challenges. And then that's at the sort of lower level. At the higher level of sort of corporate America, there's a profound criticism that starts to really make waves in the late 80s and early 90s that among professional corporate women, starting a business is the way to break the glass ceiling. that that there are these sexist structures in place that are going to block you from upward advancement. And one of the refrains that you hear in many different quarters is, the only way I'm going to be the CEO of this place is if I start my own company. And there are women who often do that. This dovetails with literature in the history of feminism about the importance of, or the debates over the kind of women can have it all, right? The kind of combination of domestic and professional achievement, and the challenges of that whole framing as well. But it's very much part of it, right? And so this is something that I find to be a really kind of important through line for this whole story. I think Julia, did you?
Yeah, I wonder what you found about the group of people who have the regular job and the business.
Right.
Because that seems kind of, it's sort of like, oh, I'm pretty good at this. I'll start a business on top of my regular job.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of different ways that you can look at that. It's certainly a phenomenon, right? And it becomes, in some ways, easier in more recent years with the kinds of technologies that we have. I think one way to look at that is that it's a function of either dissatisfaction or stagnation in people's traditional employment. It's also a sort of a cultural phenomenon about sort of monetizing a hobby, something that maybe in an earlier generation would have been a thing that you did and you weren't trying to make a ton of money off of it. You were just you did it because you enjoyed it. There's something in the zeitgeist that says, well, this if you like doing it, don't do it for free. If you're good at it, don't do it for free.
But it has no value without that.
So there's
because so often. I mean, there was something I think in the Times one time about people who are knitters on Etsy and the amount of hours they'd have to put in order to finish products, and but it isn't even about making that money. It's about the legitimacy of getting a hobby, something more elevated, which is itself ridiculous.
Well, I think there's a lot of different ways, and I'm looking at Julia, and I'm looking at Daniela, and others who do exactly this, right? Who do have a sort of what you might call a side hustle, and again, there is as many reasons to do that as there are people who do it. And one of my positions in this book is I'm not really interested in judging anybody's decisions, but I am interested in some of the cultural and political implications of sort of establishing something as the norm, as the goal. If somebody is monetizing a hobby, whether it's knitting for Etsy or anything else, because society or the workplace or the market is not meeting their needs, it strikes me that putting all the attention on the monetizing the hobby and ignoring the underlying problem is not going to solve. It's not going to make the economy better for the majority of people.
So Ben, one interesting thing that's going on in the 70s, 80s, 90s, as in more recent couple of decades, as the push culturally and politically towards small business is in the ascendancy. As you noted in this conversation, there's a lot of contingency that faces business owners. Doesn't work out well for many of them. Failure rates are actually pretty high. Exactly what they are is hard to sometimes pin down, but 25, 30% of firms don't make it. A lot of those are insolvent. Bankruptcy rates went up through this period. And so but at the same time, bankruptcy law becomes more difficult for debtors. Mm-hmm. So wonder if you could reflect on that a little bit. What the forces that are driving less forgiving bankruptcy policies at the very time that people are pushing people to take risks.
I think what we see gets back to this very significant long-term change in the returns to capital versus the returns to labor. The economy increasingly is structured in the United States in the 1980s and 1990s to reward holders of capital, which can be investors and people who have put money into ventures like the kinds of businesses that you're describing. It makes sense as that becomes the more dominant way of earning profits, that one would push back against forgiveness of debts, and then at the same time, it also makes sense that the people who are sort of high up in the financial world, where this kind of ethos frankly does not seem to penetrate nearly to the same extent, would want to encourage lots of people to go out and borrow money and take risks, because they're not the ones taking the risks. I note that the best way to make a ton of money in the United States in the 1980s, 1990s, and further forward is to be in the financial services industry and to be a very well-paid investor. Not necessarily as an owner, although if you're the one whose name is on the hedge fund, you're doing particularly well. But you could be the young associate in the Wall Street firm, and you're still doing very, very well. That's not the kind of people who are often getting this sort of I should go out and strike my own, hang out my own shingle kind of message, nearly to the same extent. So that at the tippy top of the economic pyramid, we see a sort of striking lack of this ethos. And I would suspect, and I'd have to look more carefully at bankruptcy law practices, that you can draw a line between the incentives of the investor class and the kind of pressure that people put on kind of the rest of society, the lower part of the pyramid. Wayne?
Ben, what you were just saying about the 80s made me think about movies. And some of the quintessential movies from the 80s, Secret of My Success, Risky Business, the notion that, in fact, the way you're going to make money is to go be an investor, to get a job in an investment firm, and be a salaried employee with bonuses associated with what you bring in by commission.
Right.
That's Secret of My Success, is the fundamental plot line. How would you identify the shift in movies as popular cultural signals to owning your own business?
I think the answer is it's nice work if you can get it, right? It's the 80s becomes known as the sort of decade of deals and the decade of excess. And you didn't mention, we could have Wall Street, and all of these movies that, actually were trying to criticize this, but end up sort of inflating the idea that this is the way to success. The reality is that if you didn't go to a handful of very exclusive universities, you're probably not going to get that job. And the whole work your way up from the mailroom thing is also not happening, right? You're not working your way up from the mailroom. You're working your way up from the 80-hour-a-week summer internship, your junior year at Yale, and then, am I okay to pick on Yale? And then then you figure out whether you can either make a mint and not burn out, or whether you then burn out and go do something else. The question of popular culture kind of failing to see this, I think, is fast. There are ways in which popular culture sees it. I would refer you to Coming to America, right? Where there's an entire plot line about a developing, a poor part of Queens where the whole thing is that they're ripping off McDonald's. But it's, that's sort of the virtuous small business owner struggling against the forces that surround him. And
there's also, I think, an uptick, in the idea of like the awful, owner and corporation, and even, and being bumbling fools. Even looking at Barbie per se, seeing, Will Ferrell as the head of the corporation is kind of a joke, right? And if people don't know what they're doing, really, right? I think that becomes more prevalent in films. And I think there are all these films that have to do with like this kind of someone coming up with their own. I think like Eva Longoria directed a film about someone who had created like spicy Cheetos or something. It was like recently, and it did not do well. Yeah, Flamin' Hot, right, exactly. And things about food trucks and like and seeing it as like these are people who came and saved the community through their small business, and they brought it back to like that.
Which is, I think that's a very modern, like very recent twist on this, because the flip side, maybe the pinnacle of the embrace of all this is like the kind of You've Got Mail era of the late 90s, where the setup is like the big bad box store takes over and sends the small town bookstore out of business, but Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks still fall in love at the end, right? So it's all still okay.
For me. Yeah. No, it's true.
All right.
Did you have a
final
follow-up?
I was just gonna say that there is the whole movement of if you can become a rich YouTuber,
Oh.
or you can become, if you can be really good in become famous somehow. Basically, become famous. That's the path to.
That's right. And you know what? If you can play first base for the Yankees, you can also make a lot of money. So good luck to you,
Well,
right?
that's another book to explore what happened to those people. I remember I met someone at an airport one time who she was like a teen mom, and she had made herself into a YouTube sensation. And I was like, I want to find out what happens. And like even 5 years from now, is that even going to be? Are people going to be on this platform and care? She's probably on TikTok now.
Right.
That's it. That's happening.
And I think this is where part to kind of bring all this around. This is where I think distinguishing between long-term big picture trends and individual stories is really important to both understanding history and national culture and politics, but also to making decisions and advising your kids. I mean, just like you probably wouldn't advise your teenager to put all of their eggs into the I'm going to play first base for the Yankees basket. Maybe you also shouldn't, recommend that they become the next TikTok star or the next. Somebody will, right? Someone is going to make a lot of money in whatever the next big thing is. But as a matter of policy, as a matter of social well-being, and as a matter of parenting, I think we should have a better sense of what the world actually looks like.
This has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren.